supporting the implementation of the skills agenda. Dear Members of Parliament, I want to thank you for your support and for your inspiration. I look forward to cooperating with you, and as I mentioned in my introduction, the documents will be available as soon as possible. This is when they are formally adopted on next Friday. Thank you very much.
Grazie, ringrazio la commissaria.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for being with us during this debate. And that closes the discussion.
Due strade, o di sospendere per...
We could perhaps just adjourn for a moment until such time as the Minister arrives representing the Vice President, our representative, or we could continue without the Minister. I think that we should perhaps just wait for a minute and then we'll take it from there. Okay, we will adjourn for 1 minute.
Non arriva il ministro Koenders. Ah, eccolo, eccolo. Sì, buonasera. Allora, l'ordine del giorno.
The agenda says that there will be a statement by the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy on the situation in Bangladesh. So we'll give the floor right away to the Vice President, or the representative of the Vice President, which is Mr. Koenders. Welcome, Mr. Koenders, you have the floor.
Bene, adesso c'è il brillantino e possiamo iniziare. Prego, Ministro. Come? Yeah, well, you have to tell me this. I don't know this. Yeah, I don't know if somebody lights it up or not. The European Union and Bangladesh are long-term partners. Our relationship has led to results that are mutually beneficial for both sides, in particular on trade, investment and development. The European Union is the first destination for Bangladesh exports. The combination of European Union's substantial investments in Bangladesh with European Union's development assistance has certainly contributed to Bangladesh economic growth and to its achievements in terms of poverty reduction and reaching the Millennium Development Goals. And the relationship is still growing. The European Union and Bangladesh continue addressing together new challenges, such as contributing to the sustainability of Bangladesh's ready-made garment industry, I think a very important topic, through the Sustainability Compact, and more recently addressing comprehensively migration and mobility. In this context, the first European Union-Bangladesh dialogue on migration management was held in Dhaka on the 5th of April 2016. The most important policy objectives in Bangladesh are possibly becoming a middle-income country by 2021 and therefore continue lifting Bangladeshi people out of poverty, which I think has to be the first priority. Achieving this very ambitious target will need the involvement and determination of all Bangladeshi citizens and institutions, as well as the support of Bangladesh international partners. The worrying political evolution in Bangladesh could be very detrimental in this respect. And since the controversial January 2014 elections, boycotted by the opposition and criticized by the international community, the political, human rights and security situation in the country has unfortunately steadily deteriorated. The resolutions on Bangladesh adopted by the European Parliament in the last 2 years cover these 2014 elections, human rights violations and freedom of expression. The High Representative Federica Mogherini, her spokespersons and the European Union heads of mission have also issued statements on these and other issues such as the death penalty and the recent brutal killings, even yesterday, of independent thinkers and activists. This is a very worrying situation. These resolutions and statements over the last couple of years track and summarise, I think, very well a growing collective concern in the European Union about its political evolution in Bangladesh. We think it's important that an overall new social and political consensus will need to be built in Bangladesh for democracy, human rights, freedom of expression and political liberties to be fully restored, promoted and protected in the country. It's time to put an end to arbitrary arrest and harassment of opposition leaders, to restore tolerance and to open spaces for public political debate. It's also time to ensure freedom of expression as a fundamental human right and to promote respect. It is also essential to ensure the protection and safety of all citizens. Especially the brutal murders and horrifying attacks on citizens must cease, and of course investigations into these killings need to take place and those responsible have to be brought to justice. It is now time for the government of Bangladesh and democratic political parties together to engage in real dialogue for the country's stability, democracy and economic development. Mr. President, honourable members, the European Union needs a Bangladesh where core universal human rights values are upheld. I was speaking already about the socio-economic rights. They have to be effectively protected, but of course where institutions respect the rule of law and fully ensure protection and safety of all citizens, there is a priority to be put where tolerance and freedom of expression are promoted. Of course, the government of Bangladesh has a primary role in this perspective. We will continue following closely the situation and addressing our concerns at our regular dialogue with the government of Bangladesh, and we count in this on the support of you, the members of the European Parliament. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Grazie, Ministro Koenders.
Well, thank you very much, Minister Koenders. Let's open our debate and we'll begin by hearing from the political groups. Mr. Preda, for 2 minutes. You have the floor.
Ca membru al delegației pentru relațiile cu țările din Asia de
Thank you very much. Well, as representing the European Parliament for the ASEAN countries, I'm very concerned about the wave of violence in Bangladesh over the last few weeks. The representatives of a number of religious minorities have been brutally murdered. Hindus, Sufis, Christians, Buddhist monks, but also other people who have called for secularism and pluralism. These people have been murdered, attacked, threatened. Pretty much anyone who supports the idea of freedom of expression and freedom of religious faith. So that is why I would like once again to repeat the appeal made by the European Parliament and call upon the Bangladeshi authorities to shed light upon these murders and crimes, to put the perpetrators before the court and sentence them. Of course, the Bangladeshi authorities have already expressed the intention to show zero tolerance to these kinds of crimes. And I realise that investigations are underway. But of course, all of these murders do need to be solved. Minister, you said that Bangladesh faces a very serious political and social situation since the last elections, which was boycotted by the opposition. We have a major problem. We sent an electoral observation mission there, and the boycott of the elections is the source of a large amount of political tension in this country. We are all very much aware that Bangladesh is an important economic partner for us. That's not something that we can forget. We need to talk to our partners in Dhaka and call for a major improvement in the political climate.
Thank you, Mr. Preda. And now, on behalf of the S&D Group, Mrs. Gill, you have the floor, please.
Minister, at least 10 secular and liberal activists have been murdered in cold blood since the start of 2016 alone. Daesh and Al-Qaeda claimed many of these attacks, yet Bangladeshi authorities systematically refuse to acknowledge their presence, opting to use these atrocious killings for electoral purposes instead of protecting activists and vulnerable groups like LGBTI. The blatant failure of Bangladesh International Crimes Tribunal to meet fair trial standards is fueling more violence and extremism. We can't afford to let Bangladesh descend into full-blown violence. We need to do the following: set up projects to counter violent extremism with India as a bridgehead will help us gain foothold and stop the country from becoming a regional stronghold for terrorism. Second, the focus of all sides in Bangladesh, government and opposition, should be on genuine accountability for the crimes today and for those committed in '72. Extrajudicial killings and arbitrary arrests have to stop. So I call upon the High Representative to take a lead in the UN on further steps implementing sanctions against those responsible for abusive policies on all sides and supporting an internationally supervised judicial mechanism to ensure justice is served. Thank you.
Tannock, prego, 1 minuto e 30.
Mr. Tannock.
Bangladesh is a secular South Asian democracy, and it's a political model that I strongly support. Its championing of religious tolerance, freedom of expression, women's rights and education are values that we would recognise and celebrate here in Europe. Such values are, however, threatened in Bangladesh right now, but not by the government, as some in this chamber will seek to argue this evening, but by Islamist extremists. In 1971, Jamaat-e-Islami was rightly banned in Bangladesh, not only for the atrocities committed during the civil war, but also for its continued ideological campaign and terrorist activities against the secular state. Since the lifting of this ban in 1979, Jamaat continues along this path with reported links to extremist jihadist groups. And I urge tonight the opposition party, the BNP, to end and denounce its links with them so that it can fulfil its proper secular democratic role in opposition. Only today was the body of a Hindu priest found near to his temple, the killing clearly motivated by his religion. He joins the many others that have been murdered in similar attacks: academics, gay rights activists, secular bloggers and journalists, as well as other individuals from religious minorities such as Christian, Buddhist or Ahmadi. Bangladesh, as one of the poorest countries in the world, does not enjoy the luxuries of established and properly trained and sophisticated security services as we do here in the West. As we in the European Union battle against our own extremist insurgencies, we must offer more support and sympathy to Bangladesh's government and less words of criticism and condemnation. Thank you.
Grazie. Onorevole.
Thank you. Mr. Shaki, please.
Thank you, President, Minister Koenders and colleagues. I want to focus today on the extreme violence against human rights defenders, LGBT activists, journalists, bloggers and religious minorities. Too many innocent victims have been killed and the debate today is long overdue. The pace of outrageous incidents still increases, and as recently as today, a Hindu priest was hacked to death. Our thoughts go out to the victims and their families and loved ones. It is widely believed that violent Islamists, terror militia are behind these despicable acts, and clearly liberal voices and religious minorities are the targets. It is important that the government does all it can to prevent more horrendous bloodshed. And while we see that authorities have launched new actions against terrorist groups, concerns remain that more could have been done to protect people, and also that point-blank killings of suspects are not a proportionate and adequate response, not as just or as impactful as a fair trial to bring people to justice. Given the long list of many people killed by Islamist militia since 2013, it is surprising and actually quite disappointing that EU leadership has not been stronger and that we have not been more vocal. You rightfully pointed out to the important ties and the relations we have in the form of trade and development. We leveraged it before when factories collapsed, and we should leverage it again with stronger words offering assistance to tackle terrorism, but in an appropriate manner. So I wanted to ask you, Minister, why have we not seen more statements, or could you share more about the actual steps that EU leaders and External Action Service High Representative Mogherini have taken in reaching out to the Bangladeshi authorities? What will be the real consequences if there is a lack of adequate response to these outrageous murders? And what is happening on the part of the EU delegation or Member States delegations on the ground in Bangladesh? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Sanchez Caldente, please.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, President. Minister, after the Rana Plaza disaster, when Mrs. Ashton was a High Representative, there was much call for improvements in health and safety standards in factories in Bangladesh. There were directives passed on corporate social responsibility. More than 1,000 people have died in a factory which is part of the supply chain for European companies, and you are still calling for the fulfilment of rules which the companies want to set up. It's like setting the fox to guard the hen house. When it comes to corporate social responsibility, and you have companies like Benetton or Inditex who don't want to compensate victims, then we need to change the rules that we have. We need some kind of binding system, which means that sanctions can be levied against those who endanger lives. In October, there'll be a meeting of the working group involving the United Nations, and the European Union should be directly involved in that, because when it comes to improving human rights, we've got a lot to do. Mrs. Lambert, please, a minute and a half.
Thank you, President. And I should say at this point that I speak in my capacity as chair of the delegation for relations with countries of South Asia, which includes Bangladesh. And as others have said, the overwhelming majority of Bangladeshis are extremely proud of the fact that they are able to live as a whole range of different faiths and communities, and that it's only, we're seeing this gradual sort of escalation from those claiming to be from Islamic State or from offsprings of Al-Qaeda, attacking a range of people, as we've heard, from a shopkeeper on to gay rights activists, and indeed the murder recently of Mamnouha Akhtar, the wife of an anti-terrorist police officer. So it's time, certainly, for very strong signals from the government that society is not going to be divided, and I think we should be pleased to see the statement from 100,000 clerics on their fatwa for peace, which will be fully published on June the 18th. But a strong civil society is absolutely essential. and to provide grassroots resilience and a sense of community, rather than seeing, as we sometimes feel at the moment, the government sees the grassroots as a problem. And we really should be upholding the work of human rights defenders such as the organisation Odeka, and indeed press freedom. We're seeing far too many journalists going to jail. And we also need to see effective policing and judicial system where people really do feel that there is equality before the law. And, as others have said, we're seeing an extremely worrying situation there, which we really need to be supporting the government in its efforts, but making sure that it also acts in the best interests of all Bangladeshis.
Mr. Castaldo, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, President. We are witnessing an escalation which is very worrying, and one has to wonder why a country which has always been very tolerant, where there's been tremendous diversity, why there's been this resurgence of something else. I think that perhaps the root cause is in poverty. We know that European multinationals are exploiting textiles, rice, bearing down on people, on Bangladeshis, and this facilitates the work of Daesh and Al-Qaeda, who are penetrating ever deeper into civil society in Bangladesh. And laying the basis for radicalization. There are calls for changes to judiciary, malfunctions in the police system, progress on democracy and press freedoms. But I think that we've got to also look into our own conscience and recognise that economic and social stability in the country is a fundamental pillar to prevent radicalisation and terrorism. And let's try to be consistent and look at the behaviour of our own multinationals.
Mr. Ruas.
President, as you may know, 3 years ago, the Rana Plaza factory collapsed, killing 1,100 people and injuring more than 2,500. Bangladesh is the second largest clothing exporter in the world, and 60% of its production is exported to the European Union, to here. This catastrophe was a terrible wake-up call for the need for concrete action in improving building safety and working conditions, not only in this country but also in other countries that supply the EU. 3 years after the signature of the Sustainability Pact, we've seen some very positive commitments made by the government of Bangladesh. But nevertheless, a lot more needs to be done, and I think that a lot more needs to be done. For example, the government has to respect Convention 87 of the ILO, extending application of the employment law to the free zones for industrial exports, and to continue its struggle against corruption and inspecting properly the observance of labour rules. And I hope that this pact will have a positive impact. And I think that this country should serve as an example to other countries, and I hope that it will lead to more coordinated and effective work on the part of the international community.
Mr. Weidenholzer, for 1 minute, please.
President, the situation in Bangladesh is very alarming. The danger of civil war cannot be ruled out. The two camps have been facing each other and have been at loggerheads, and this has paralysed the democratic institutions. Violence is on the increase, and of course there are those who are happy to make hay and to exploit the situation. The treatment of human rights defenders has been worsening. They're being intimidated, threatened. The use of violence has taken place, where a Christian was hacked to death on Sunday, where we've seen LGBTI activists as well bearing the brunt. It's still possible to stop this vicious circle. At this point, Europe can play an important role. The voice of Europe is heard in Bangladesh, and we can still prevent that happening.
Mr. Demesmaeker, please, 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Minister, there is plenty of reason for us to be worried about Bangladesh, particularly when there's more repression against the media, businesses, human rights defenders and the opposition, and religious inspiration in the violence as well. There is a fundamentalist tendency in Islam which is trying to gain ground, and we must stop extremism. If we must stop the continuing radicalization, because this rhetoric could lead to very dangerous results. I support the priorities, but we do have leverage with the biggest trading partner, with the biggest customer for textiles because of close cooperation. Bangladesh uses the Everything But Arms initiative, whereby zero tariff imports take place, and that was not something that cannot be unconditional. In the wake of the Rana Plaza disaster, we've seen that we need to get our companies to up their game as well. We must use the leverage that we have in order to support economic and social development in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Well, as a member of the Sri Lanka delegation, I share the concerns about the humanitarian situation in Bangladesh. The political situation is characterized by a constant state of conflict between the Arami League and the BNP. It seems an unsolvable situation. And at the same time, there are constant murders carried out by radical fanatics. There is struggle between religious minorities against foreigners and against secular activists. The situation is so politicized that there are constant faulty decisions being taken. Measures need to be taken to preserve the rule of law, freedom of expression, and the political system. Let's help the political parties to get around the table once again that are so essential in creating hope for people.
Prego, Maria.
Mrs. Arena, thank you very much, President. The human rights situation in Bangladesh is a matter of deep concern, and the reports from NGOs show this. The authorities have to make sure that fundamental rights and human rights are respected, but we also have a responsibility to make sure that European companies ensure that work done on their behalf is done with respect for human rights and in decent conditions. We were all outraged after the Rana Plaza disaster, but what have we done since then to change things? Not very much. Not many legislative initiatives, either from the Commission or from the Council, which might have helped to make sure that human rights are respected by these companies. We haven't had any legislative initiatives in terms of reparations or compensation that companies should pay, or very much about their general responsibilities. We do hear a lot about political crimes, but I think economic crimes need to be on our agenda as well. Thank you. Mr. Belder, please, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. I believe, Minister, that you need to be Christians in Bangladesh or belong to one of the other faith minorities. If you are such, then you have to fear for your life and limb, because the attacks on Christians and other minority faith groups is on the increase. The guarantee, the constitutional guarantee for freedom of religion is under threat and under pressure. Officially, there is no room for Christians to respect their faith, and we're seeing discrimination. The rights of minorities are not being respected, and in the media as well. The media also play a part. And en passant, the regime ignores the existence of the activities of Salafist and terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda is there. We spend money on human rights projects, and part of that money is for religious minorities. And I hope that we can get confirmation from the Mr. Koenders for the presidency to that end. Thank you.
Chairman, distinguished Mr. Minister, colleagues. I'm seriously concerned of unprecedented violence against the members of religious and ethnic minorities, civil society activists, journalists and the bloggers that swept Bangladesh recently. There seems to be no clear end to the tragic news. These brutal attacks have not only targeted anyone opposing mainstream views, but have seriously infringed on freedom of expression in the country. We have to press on the Bangladeshi government to properly investigate these crimes. The citizens need to be assured that their freedoms are respected, impunity is ended and the rule of law is re-established. Otherwise, a carte blanche to radical behaviour and unpunished violence endangers the stability of Bangladesh, with potential implications for the entire region of Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Gomez, please, 1 minute.
The Sakharov Prize winner for 1994, together with other Sakharov Prize laureates, has denounced the wave of violence that has affected its country. He cannot return due to the death threats. Murders are constantly taking place. Members of religious minorities, sexual minorities, bloggers, journalists, foreign citizens. People are dying without proper investigations taking place to identify the perpetrators, as well as other crimes as well. There are arbitrary assassinations on the part of the security sources. We have a link to Bangladesh through a cooperation agreement. After the Rana Plaza catastrophe, it's unacceptable for human rights to be left in second place. We need to get across to the Bangladeshi administration that they are denying the reality if they insist that IS and Al-Qaeda are not active in their country, whereas in fact that they are responsible for the violence.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to Mr. Bashir, I think we should suspend the session for 2 minutes because we have a slight technical problem.
Riprendiamo, onorevole Bashir.
Let's start. Mr. Bashir, 1 minute, please.
Onorevole Bashir.
Minister, tragically for the people of Bangladesh, recent barbaric murders remind us of the country's lengthy history of political instability and wanton violence. While we must do our utmost not to meddle in the affairs of sovereign nations, we have a responsibility to condemn violence while encouraging and fostering political dialogue. To this end, the only viable way for Bangladesh to get itself back on track is for the country's leading political parties to show real leadership to get the country out of this impasse. One cannot ignore the toxic effect of the ruling coalition's blatant electoral manoeuvring in the run-up to the previous elections. It created a climate of great institutional mistrust and has only added fuel to the fire of violence that we are witnessing now. On the other hand, the opposition would do well to distance itself from extremist groups, developing real policies for their countries instead. Ultimately, the only way to guarantee a fresh start for Bangladesh and its people is for new elections to be called under a caretaker government as soon as possible. Thank you.
Grazie. Onorevole Panzeri, prego.
Mr. Panzeri, for 1 minute, please. Thank you, President. The situation in Bangladesh, I think, shows all of the symptoms of the poor health of freedom and the chances that the country is going to break apart. And I think what we've seen shows just how serious the situation is. We can't turn a blind eye to that. The government is simply not doing enough. And that's something which we should point out. There's a danger that we'll end up covering up acts by criminal groups. The European Union has to go beyond fine words and make sure that the government takes a firmer stand. We have to try and use all of the instruments that we have available as well. I just want to reiterate the position set out by the Parliament last November. We have to do everything to put a stop to the violence and the intimidation and the violation of human rights, because that's very important.
Onorevole Zahradil, prego, un minuto.
Mr. Saradil, please, 1 minute.
Non c'è?
Is he not here? Okay, so the next speaker on the list is Mrs. Jongerius. 1 minute for you as well.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Minister. I think that it's quite right to say that socio-economic rights are also part and parcel of the human rights picture, which I want to focus on now, because it's been said that it's 3 years after Rana Plaza, after that disaster, and we need to acknowledge the fact that not a great deal has changed, even though that there's been a lot of profit made. But the trade unions have not been able to force improvements in the situation. The labour law legislation in Bangladesh still has very high legal thresholds, and that means that it's easy for the employers to intimidate the workforce, to fire them and to subject them to mistreatment. The export processing zones don't come under the labour law legislation, and that's a great pity, because guaranteeing decent living conditions for men and women who make the clothes that we wear is something that should be important for us, and social rights are so important. Thank you.
Thank you, and yes, and now we've got the catch the eye period. Mr. Shaw, first of all, please.
Okay.
Doesn't seem to be here. Mr. Marias, please, for 1 minute.
President, as has transpired in the course of this debate, the situation in Bangladesh is explosive. There is ongoing violation of human rights. The Christian populations and other faith communities and minorities are experiencing oppression. There is an Islamist movement which attacks journalists and bloggers. In social terms, as we've said, there is systematic violation of people's labour laws and labour rights, particularly in the factories, and safety conditions are not being respected. Bangladesh is an important partner for the European Union, and they export to Europe, particularly textile products. Therefore, in consequence, it is possible for the European Union to exert pressure, to keep up the pressure on Bangladesh, to make sure that human rights are honoured and respected, the rule of law, and in particular transparency and democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Konečka, please.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Well, in my speech I wanted to talk about the terrible, dangerous situation that many workers find themselves in the textile sector. 400 factories employing 6 million workers. The workers of Bangladesh are the worst paid in the world. Their salaries do not even cover their primary needs. Many of these workers are in the employment of multinational companies who are putting all of the risks on the shoulders of the workers who have to struggle under extremely difficult working conditions. The buildings collapse, for example. I hope that the High Representative, who is involved in negotiations with Bangladesh, should stress the important role of trade unions in putting an end to this situation. Thank you.
Mr. Sugar, please.
Thank you. Bangladesh seems to be on a course departing from democracy and leading towards insecurity. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina seems to be determined to destroy the opposition Bangladesh National Party before the next election in 2018. This continues an already authoritarian course of eliminating any opposition via banning political parties and changing laws that normally guarantee the integrity of elections. Also, 5 different Islamist extremist attacks in the past year have been targeted minorities, activists and intellectuals. No one has been punished for any of these crimes. Instead, Hassana blames the BNP for the attacks, giving justification to further persecute and discredit them in the name of national security. On an issue where all other powers, China, India and the United States, have failed to raise any alarm. The EU needs to put pressure on the Bangladeshi government to respect the fundamental principles of democracy, those of free and fair elections, the right to political opposition and the responsibility of a government to protect its citizens from violence. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Minister Koenders.
Grazie, Presidente. Let me start also by joining the members who have expressed their outrage about the killing of the Hindu priest hacked to death. And also on behalf of the Council, I would like to offer my condolences to the families, the next of kin. And obviously also for us it's extremely important that those that are responsible for this are brought to justice. Let me say a few words about the input that you have brought to the debate tonight. I think we are all quite conscious of the fact that Bangladesh is an enormously complex country, extremely vulnerable. I think in terms of the environmental issues, it's the most vulnerable country in the world. It's the most densely populated country in the world. And it's a country that has different aspects. On the one hand, it has reached some progress in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, which is actually amazing if you look to the rise of civil society in Bangladesh. We have seen that through very important progress made through civil society in cooperation with the government. Enrollment in primary education is now close to 100%. At the same time, we see a reduction in poverty. Maternal mortality has declined by 40% in 9 years. That's a positive news. And at the same time, today I think the Council joins you in looking at some of the very negative developments that we've seen. And first of all, I think the shrinking space for the democratic and secular opposition comes at par with all the issues that you have mentioned, the multiplication of terrorist attacks, targeting bloggers, religious minorities, including Christians, I would say, foreigners and law enforcement officers. The most brutal murders included a student, a professor, 2 LGTBI activists with a policeman and a security guard, a Hindi tailor, the wife of a police officer, a Christian grocer, a Buddhist monk. We're talking about a rise in these kind of very violent human rights violations, and we see that at the same time a limiting of political space for the political opposition as well as for civil society. That obviously worries with you the Council, and I wanted to say that obviously beyond all kind of declarations we do actually give out regularly, and I can give you most of the statements that we have given out in the last couple of months. Obviously, it's not enough to make statements, and all these statements refer to the facts that you have been putting forward, including the violence and the need for justice. I think it's also important that we work on countering, first of all, the issues that are behind this, including projects to counter violent extremism, to assist in de-radicalization. We will continue, and I'll come back to that in a second, in our human rights instruments, this important element, because we are very worried about the rise of that, and the importance also of the government, for the government of Bangladesh, to acknowledge the risks of this radicalism, including possibly the risks posed by ISIS. Therefore, this was also in answering to some of the questions, the dialogue in the context of the United Nations that some of you have mentioned is extremely important. It is also important that our delegations reach out not only through projects in these areas, but also in the bilateral meeting at the ASEM summit to the government of Bangladesh on these very disturbing developments. When we talk about human rights, we should talk about the fact that the human rights situation is steadily degrading, mainly at the expense of the most vulnerable segments of the population of Bangladesh. And I think really your appeal should be communicated. The response by law enforcement agencies seems at best too slow and inadequate. And the most important and iconic case is the horrible rape and assassination of a 19-year-old female student in the military cantonment of Komiya that still remains unexplained, as one example. I wanted to mention, in the context of this complex situation in Bangladesh, also the sustainability compact. Especially in Bangladesh, but also in other countries, obviously, we have to talk about human rights in its broader sense of the word, including socio-economic rights and the role of unions and so on and so forth. Now, following this Rana Plaza collapse, where everybody was, I think, extremely horrified, and this is now already more than 3 years ago, over 1,100 people dead, thousands injured. This sustainability compact was agreed between the government and the European Union, the United States and the ILO, with commitments on 3 interlinked pillars in the ready-made garment industry. And I would like to support all of you who have said this is not only a compact that should remain on paper, but needs really the operationalization and implementation. And also the responsibilization of the business sector in order to ensure that it actually works. I think it requires some elements. First, the respect of labour rights, in particular freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. So that includes, I think, the important role of the unions. Secondly, the structural integrity of factory buildings and occupational safety and health. And I think we should also support where we can, also bilaterally, but also in the context of the European Union, the government of Bangladesh and others in ensuring this. Then, of course, responsible business conduct is absolutely important. The donors fund the ready-made garment industry program in the context of remediation measures that goes up to $200 million, so it's not small fish, so to speak. Canada has recently also joined as a partner. We recognize progress made by Bangladesh, but of course, and I think that was correctly mentioned, the need is there for the government to facilitate trade unions registration, to upgrade the Directorate of Labour with additional staff and resources, and to ensure that the legal framework is applicable also in the export processing zones, protecting freedom of association and collective bargaining. I think these are important points. Through what do we have as instruments? First of all, it's of course the dialogue we have with the government of Bangladesh, and I think it should focus especially on these areas, continuing progress in the SDGs, at the same time ensuring that we are worried about the deterioration on political space and the degradation of the security situation, and see also where we can assist, because this is a major issue that goes to the responsibility, of course, of all actors, including the government first and foremost, but also other actors, terrorist groups, responsible and irresponsible political parties, to play their role in ensuring that this political degradation doesn't continue. And certainly through our European Union assistance, we have a development assistance under DCI from up to 690 million, to ensure that actually our programs are up to date in referring to the present situation and developments. There was one question on sanctions. I'm not such a great fan of sanctions towards Bangladesh at this point, speaking obviously also on behalf of the European Council. I think we have three lines of action now in the context of what I just said regarding the SDGs, regarding the human rights dialogue and the political dialogue on the critical issues we just discussed, and the compact. And I think that would be better than formally suspending trade cooperation negotiations. That would most likely be detrimental and hardly facilitate any improvement in the political, human rights and security situation in Bangladesh. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Grazie, Ministro Koenders.
Thank you very much, Minister Koenders. You're going to stay with us for the next debate, but that concludes our discussion on Bangladesh. Moving on, there will now be a joint debate on the Philippines with three recommendations from Mr. Brok. So we'll give him the floor now. Mr. Brok, please.
Herr Präsident.
President in Office of Council, colleagues, this is consent. We are asked to give our consent on an agreement with the Philippines. On the 11th of July, the agreement was officially signed. If we do this tomorrow, then we have to remember also that a number of member states have ratified already, and it's possible that with that, this will enter into force by the year's end. The Croatia protocol is there as well. We also have a resolution, and I think that our relations, our bilateral relations, should be strengthened. It's in the interest of both sides. And I believe also that we should cement these ties and help the Philippines on the path towards greater democracy and greater respect for fundamental rights. And I believe that the relationship can be put on a more formal basis, on a firmer basis. This is a big country at the center of Southeast Asia, and it's a big economic and political partner for us. The Philippines are at a very important, or they are next to very important air navigation routes, sea lanes as well, in the South China Sea. And given the territorial debates taking place there, this means that we greatly need a stakeholder for peaceful solutions, and hence the need for us to further develop good relations with the Philippines. The Philippines are involved in that theatre of dispute in the South China Sea. China's aggressive methods in the contested waters are very important and giving rise to much concern in the international community. And I wish to renew our appeal to get a peaceful solution to the difficulty on the basis of